talk about something very drastically different than this morning as well as yesterday. We're going to talk about zero waste. Zero waste in Singapore. Rémi Césaro is a founder and director of the consultancy business Zero Waste City. Rémi provides engineering consulting services to large commercial and industrial facilities around waste management, efficient energy efficiency, and packaging sustainability assessment. He worked in Australia and Singapore as resource efficiency for large businesses, covering a wide range of industry and technology. He is certified Total Resource Use Efficiency Advisors by the US Green Building Council Incorporation. This certification is recognized his knowledge in zero waste programs and his ability to support businesses to achieve the true zero waste certification. It is important for us to think about this notion of zero waste and to what extent it makes sense with our theme of the week, Ways of Life 2050. Rémi, thank you very much for being with us this afternoon.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. Thanks a lot again for the invitation to be here in this theater. I will be talking not only about zero waste today. I'm going to take you into a journey of sustainability around physical resources and energy. I've been invited to speak to you and give you clues on what might happen to our future in the next 30 years. And I'm going to tell you the start of our journey into the Anthropocene. What futures are we being promised at the moment for 2050? So let's open our crystal ball and let's see what futures you might read in the newspapers at this moment. One of the most common you hear is advanced technologies. We are moving to a field of transhumanism, where technologies and human body merge to create new superbodies, superhumans. Another future we are being promised is we are finally on the verge to become the first interplanetary species and colonize Mars. Another one you might start to hear a bit more is a shift to go back to farms and leave cities and live more simple lives. And you have another one that we hear sometimes that is actually quite scary, is a potential chaos in the future with third world wars and so on. Obviously, no one knows what's waiting for us for the next 30 years. However, science is able to tell us what is not going to happen. In this presentation, I will talk about two things: climate change and the depletion of resources. So let's start. So to tell you our futures, I need to tell you our past first. So let's go back into a journey 200 years ago in the 1800. 1800, here on this chart you have the total energy used by the humanity around the world, which is only biomass. 200 years ago, we were extracting raw resources using cows, horses, our human hands. We were using wind, water to transform those resources. We were using horses and wind to transport those resources. There were some services available, but only to some elite in the society. But things changed. Over the 1800th century, we discovered a new source of energy, coal. And coal completely transforms the way society works. And for the first time, industry were able to mechanize. Coal and the steam machine were allowed us to transform a heat source into mechanical power. And that was the time when we started to mass produce. Our logistics started to transform as well. We created a steamboat. We created steam train. And finally, we were able to transport a huge amount of goods in very long distances. And we discovered a new form of energy, oil. And this has given birth to our modern economy with the mechanization of the agriculture, the multiplication of our effort to extract resources from mines. We have started to imagine robots that can do the work of humans in the industry with much greater efficiency, much greater precision. And we developed a new form of transportation by flying. So fossil fuel has allowed us to fly, to dive, and to transport goods and extract goods from our planet much easier than ever before. And obviously, that's pretty nice things, and our energy consumption, our use of fossil fuel has only grown since then. A few things happen in the meantime, and I'm going to tell you a few stories which are actually scientific papers. 50 years ago, in 1972, the limits to growth was published. It is 1.5 years of scientific research. Basically, the question they were asking was how systems interact between themselves and what can be said about the long-term trends for the human civilization. Telling you about this book will take several hours. I'm just going to give you some clues about what this book says. This book looked into 5 systems: pollution, population, food per capita, industrial output, non-renewable resources. The question was, how do those systems interact with each other? For instance, if you have more food, you can have more people. But if you have more people, you can also have more industrial output, which also increases the food output. But because you have more industrial output, you also consume more resources. And because you consume more resources, you might also increase the population, which also might decrease your population. The question is, how do they interact with each other? What will be the consequences? So what they did is, in 1970, they looked at the history of the last 70 years. They tried to model how the system might interact, what was the trend for the last 70 years, and what will happen if we continue in that trajectory. They made 11 or 13 different models. The one I'm going to show you here is called the standard run, business as usual. When they wrote this book, they basically raised an alarm. They basically said that unless ambitious policies and social transformations are engaged right now, the civilization might face existential challenges within the middle of the 21st century, which is right now. Anyway, as I said, no one can predict the future. Whoever you talk to is just crystal ball. You can just argue about the accuracy of your hypotheses to better model your future. Anyway, this publication was probably one of the most read scientific papers in the world. 30 million copies of this book were sold. That was 50 years ago. 30 years later, around 2008, the CSIRO made a study to find out how did those different outputs trended against the model, the projection. And here's the conclusion. As shown in this study, the observed historical data from 1970 to 2000 mostly closely match the simulated result of the limit to growth standard run scenario for almost all the outputs reported. This scenario, the standard run, results in global collapse before the middle of the century. The comparison is well within uncertainty bounds of nearly all the data in terms of both magnitude and the trends over time. You can obviously read the paper if you want. So here's what this model was predicting 50 years ago. So what this model says here is, what's going to happen, what they were predicting that will happen in the coming years is that we will reach a point of very high depletion of resources. You have to understand that when we extract resources from the environment, we need to invest to build infrastructure to extract those resources. But the more you extract and the less you find in the nature, therefore you have to spend even more resources to extract even lesser materials. And you get to a point where the investment is so high that you don't want to extract resources anymore. That will lead to a decline in industrial output. If we have less things to extract from the environment, we have less things to transform, and therefore there's less things to use in our society. And what they were saying is, the depletion of resources get to a point where you get a decline in industrial output, which lead afterward to a decline in food production. The reason is our current food production system is heavily dependent on the supply of fertilizers and pesticides. If the industry is not able to produce that anymore, the food production will quickly reduce, which is what you observe here. And obviously, with less food to feed the population, you eventually get a decline in population. So obviously, this model has changed a bit over time, but the trends are still relevant to this day. If you extract more resources from the environment, you get to a point where there's nothing left, and you can only try to recycle what you already extracted, or eventually decide to use less things. So obviously, we don't know if and when we will reach one of these outputs, but the one thing I can tell you already is for oil, crude oil, conventional crude oil to be exact, we have already reached the peak in 2008. That was 12 years ago. We have already reached one of these major milestones in terms of the maximum output we can expect by the extraction of resources. So that was 1972. 7 years later, another report came out. This one is particularly interesting, and this one is relevant to climate change. The Charney report. The Charney report is the very first of its kind scientific review of all the state-of-the-art of science on climate. You can read the whole thing if you want, but the key thing I want you to read is, in the foreword it says, we now have incontrovertible evidence that the atmosphere is indeed changing and that we ourselves contribute to that change. First in the report it says, we estimate the most probable global warming for doubling of CO2 to be 3 degrees Celsius plus or minus 1.5 degrees. What I want to show you here is that 40 years ago, there was clear evidence that climate change is happening, that we are responsible, and that we were already able to quantify the impact it will have on our world. This number of 3 degrees has not changed. Only the probable error has massively reduced. I think right now it's like plus or minus 0.5 degrees or 0.2, I forgot. But yet, after 40 years, which is already 2 generations of students, we still have people that say, oh, climate change doesn't exist. It's not a big deal. Well, I don't know what to say to those people, except that if you know people that actually do not believe in climate change, the one thing I can ask you to suggest to tell them is, fine, you don't believe in climate change, you don't believe in science. The question is, what can I tell you to make you revise your mindset, to review your opinion? That's the best you can do. Anyway, so that was a massive warning. And since then, what have we done? Well, basically, we have talked a lot about it. But yet, our consumption of fossil fuels has continued to grow. We have started to develop new forms of energies with nuclear and new renewable energies. But as you can see on this chart, they are a fraction of the energy we extract from our environment. By far, the biggest amount of energy we extract from the environment is fossil-based. So in those dates here, you have the creation of the IPCC in 1988. The IPCC is an intergovernmental panel on climate change, which is a United Nations program. Its goal is to gather the state-of-the-art of science on climate change to provide advice to decision makers. You have the Kyoto Protocol in 1992, which was the first commitment of developed countries to reduce carbon emissions. Well, obviously, it has not worked very well. And after that, almost 25 years later, you have the very famous Paris Agreement in 2015. I don't have the 5 years left here, but I can already tell you that those fossil fuel consumption have only increased furthermore since then. Bon, I will just give you a quick reminder of what is climate change, how it does work. So humans generate greenhouse gas emissions through our activities. The consumption of fossil fuel, our agriculture, and so on. Those greenhouse gases, such as CO2, methane, and so on, accumulate into the atmosphere. Into the atmosphere, they increase the greenhouse effect of our atmosphere, which capture more which radiate more infrared into the Earth, which basically means that the atmosphere captures more solar energy. And the law of physics tells you that energy must go somewhere, and this energy will be absorbed by the ocean, the soil, and the air. And that's typically where things start to go bad for us. When it gets extracted by the ocean, the temperature of the ocean increases, the ice must melt. For the soil, you have the melting of the frozen ground with the permafrost. For the air, obviously an increase in air temperature. And all together, they disrupt our water cycle. I don't have the time to go into the depths of what can be all the consequences, subsequent consequences of the change of water cycle. I'm just going to give you a few hints. And we can already kind of predict what will the climate look like in 2050. So here you have a map of Europe, satellite map of Europe right now. And here you have the map of Madrid. Science expect that Madrid will have virtually the same climate in 2050 as Marrakesh right now. London, over there, is expected that it will have the same climate in 2050 as Barcelona right now. As a rule of thumb, in 2050, the climate of cities in the northern hemisphere will shift to warmer conditions on average 1,000 kilometers south. That is for the RPC 4.5, so that is a model where we stop increasing carbon emissions. We don't reduce them, which unfortunately right now is the most likely scenario. Another example for Singapore, well, I cannot tell you actually. Singapore will have a climate that does not yet exist on this planet. And that is actually true for most of cities in the Equatorian region. So I don't have a satellite picture to show you what vegetation it will be. The thing you have to understand is climate dictates the type of plant that can grow, and therefore the type of animals you can have. Obviously, with a climate like Barcelona, you cannot grow as much food as London. And with a climate as Marrakesh, you don't grow as much food as Madrid. And the change of climate will impact the type of plants you can have. And the reason why we had so many fires last year with Australia, Siberia, California, and so on, is because those plants over there are not adapted anymore to the new climate conditions. It is too dry and too hot. Another example of what are some of the consequences of global warming is deadly heat wave. There's a limit at which the human body cannot regulate its body temperature. If it's too hot and too humid, we cannot release the heat, and we can go into hypothermia and eventually die. This is a modeling of the planet in 2050 with the RPCP 4.5, and that shows you how many days per year you might expect deadly heat conditions for humans. Obviously, you can see that most of the Equatorian region is highly affected by this situation, again because with warmer air, you have more evaporation, the air is more humid, and as I said, if you have a air which is too hot and too humid, you cannot thermoregulate. All right, another thing you have to know is, so with global warming, problems are not linear. It's not because you have one more degree that you have factor 2 of consequences. It goes much faster than that. Here's an example of the IPCC report summary to show the difference between 1.5 global warming and 2 degrees global warming. Basically, you have almost 3 times more extreme heat events. You have over 2 times yield crop. And basically, with 2 degrees global warming, all the coral reef will be gone. Here's another one, particularly scary. This one shows you a qualitative indication of the risk in food supply instabilities based on the total rise of global warming. What it shows here is that with 1 degree, we can already expect some infrequent spikes of food shortages that will in fact impact the individual countries. But beyond 2 degrees, you start to have global food shortages at random times. Can we stop it? Well, the answer is no. I'm sorry. The answer is no. For 2050, the history is pretty much written. You have to understand that the climate system has a huge inertia. You cannot if we stop carbon emissions right now, it will still take 20 years before you can actually measure the impact. So basically, for 2050, based on our response to the reduction of greenhouse gases, we can expect a temperature between 2 degrees rise of global warming and 3.2. And beyond that, it will depend on what we do in the coming decades. So we cannot change it. All these things I've shown you before will happen, but we can for sure prevent things to get worse. And actually to be unsustainable for everybody. So in 2015, with the Paris Agreement, worldwide, the world has committed to maintain the global average temperature increase below 2 degrees. To achieve this target, we basically need to be carbon neutral by 2100, and actually even before that, which basically means that we need to reduce our global greenhouse gas emission by 5% every year. We are still waiting for the actual numbers, but it is expected that 2020, with the coronavirus pandemic, has resulted in a reduction of those greenhouse gas emissions by about 5%. So in other words, we need to suffer a new coronavirus on top of the one we had every year for the next 30 years to be able to achieve maybe the target of 2 degrees. All right, so let's find out, where are our carbon emissions? So you have the biggest part, which is the production of heat and the production of electricity. This is basically all the coal, gas, and oil power plants around the world. You have transportation with air, sea, freight, trucks, and cars. You have the manufacturing industry. You have the agriculture with about 6% due to livestock, rice, and soil, 7% of basically deforestation. Of all this pie chart, 2/3 is basically the consumption of primary energy sources, which is what I've shown you earlier, which is mostly coal, crude oil, gas, and then the residual part of renewable energies, or I should say low carbon energies. So if we want to be carbon neutral, we basically need to close down all those coal power plants. We need to massively reduce our transportation. Obviously, we need to reduce our input into manufacturing. We need to maybe stop eating meat, stop cutting down trees. And if we do all of this, then we have a chance. Well, it doesn't sound too hard said like this, right? So if our greenhouse gas emissions are clearly identified, if we have the knowledge, if we have the intelligence and technical, why do we struggle so much to reduce our greenhouse gas emission? If we have had this warning for 40 years, why it has been so hard to act on it? Well, here's one of the answers. Energy, the consumption of energy, is the backbone of our economy. So here you have the world GDP and the world consumption of primary energy. And this is the most beautiful correlation you might be able to find. When I do energy audit, I must say that I love to have correlation like this more often. Sadly, it doesn't happen. But anyway, so that tells you that there's a very clear correlation between energy consumption and value creation. And as I've shown you earlier, because energy is 80% plus fossil-based, you also have a correlation between greenhouse gas emission and GDP. Now, you might say, okay, fine, it's a correlation. It does not show causality. Fair enough. Let me put things in perspective. As I've shown you earlier, you have the extraction of resources, you have the transformation of the raw materials, and then you have the use of services. And energy feed the activities that happen in those different steps. Energy is what powers the mines, is what powers our trucks and chainsaws to cut trees. It's what powers the machine that we transform the good, transform the chair that you are sitting on right now. It is a machine that allows us to have air conditioning and so on. And the services also use energy. When you use Netflix, you use resources, you use energy and so on. And that's basically an economy that is driven by energy. If you remove energy sources, all these things collapse one by one. So, why are we struggling so much to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions? Well, number one answer is, that's what I've shown you with my story over the last 200 years, fossil fuel is what created our society of abundance and comfort. We can eat food from anywhere at any time. We can fly, we can dive, we can even go to space thanks to fossil fuel. We can relax independently of the outside conditions. Basically, abundant energy has made us Iron Man for real. So if you want to reduce our greenhouse gas emission, which also means reducing our energy consumption, we have to accept that we might not have all those things anymore. And that is very much a human-centric question of what are we happy to accept. A second thing, which is what I've shown you just before, energy and machines have multiplied our capacity to transform our environment, which create jobs, which create value, which create perspectives. And democracies and stable countries thrive on abundant energy sources. So here you have very much a political challenge. Imagine you are a leader running for election. Do you really think you are going to be elected if you say to your people, we are going to reduce our greenhouse gas emission, which means we're going to reduce our GDP, which means that you are going to have less purchasing power? Obviously, this is a bit hard to sell. And the third reason why it's really hard, and I'm sorry I don't have the time to go in depth of explaining why, renewable energy, or I should say low-carbon energy sources, cannot substitute our entire energy consumption from fossil fuel. We are not going to be able realistically to replace our coal power plant, gas power plant, and oil power plant just with wind turbine and solar panels. It's not going to happen. We are not going to have enough resources. So basically, between greenhouse gas emission and GDP, we have to choose. Well, to be exact, we had to choose. The choice is a bit too late for us. So now we have to deal with the consequences. So let's go back to our futures that were being promised. Advanced technologies, colony of Mars, shifting to farms, or chaos. Again, I cannot tell you what's going to happen. What I can tell you for sure is those advanced technologies and those colony of Mars, if they do happen, and I personally believe they will happen, they will only be open to a very small fraction of the world population. Only the people with high resources and high amount of money will be able to afford that. But for the vast majority of the population, this will be out of reach. The shift of going back to farms is a consequence of what I've told you earlier. If we have less energy to operate machines, we will need to spend more human efforts in getting the basic things around our life. And the chaos basically is if we continue to deny the impact that we are going to expect, people could actually lose hope and go into anarchy. So, for the next 30 years, we will witness, that's science telling us, we will witness the consequences of two major problems unfolding. First one is the symptoms of climate change, which I told you earlier. So we are going to see an expansion of hostile environments, which might most likely lead to mass migrations. And the second thing we are going to witness is the depletion of resources, the stress on our industrial sector and the contraction of our economy. This is very bleak as a future. So there's basically two extremes we can go to. We have obviously the most preferred option, which is basically a quick but gradual realignment of our societies within the planetary boundaries. And you have the other extreme, which is a complete loss of hope, disintegration of social structures that obviously we don't want. It might actually happen for a few countries, but I hope that will not be a major trend. And obviously, we have the middle option, which is repetitive shocks leading to civil unrest in specific countries. You have to realize that what we have observed in many countries over the last few years are indicators of what happened when people don't have enough food. Remember that the Syria crisis started because there was not enough food. In many cases, what we call the Arab Spring in North Africa also started because there was a massive spike in food prices, and the population wasn't happy with it. The reason I show you the lack of food, the problem with food supply before, is because that's the best driver for civil unrest. So, what I told you sounds very bleak, but don't trust me when I say there's a lot to be done. There's huge opportunities around work and activities you can do to ensure a more efficient use of resources and energy, the protection of all remaining natural reserves, building resilience in businesses and communities, and offer new narratives for the future. The word resilience, you are going to hear it more and more in the future. What it means is the ability to absorb shock. The COVID was a shock. Suddenly, we had to stop activities that had a massive impact on the social infrastructure and the society as general. What the government did was to borrow a huge amount of money to support the people that lost their jobs and the activity to restart again. That is a form of resilient system, when you can absorb shocks and get started again. But obviously here, we are not going to be able to restart anew in the long term. It will probably continue to happen for the next few years, but it's not going to be a sustained thing. If I have one advice to give you, be adaptable. Whatever you do. When you work for companies, for big companies, whether or not you are going to be a force for drive for change, at least be a force to drive awareness within companies and share the fact that we need to expect at some point that resources are not going to be as available as they used to be. And you have also need to make sure that people don't go into a severe anxiety and depression, because it's actually not too bad. If we learn our way to be adaptable and to accept to have less things than we used to have, that will be fine. And I'm going to steal a small experiment from a scientist that I've seen in a conference before. I'm going to ask you, all of you, to do a small exercise. I'm going to count until 3. 1, 2, and 3. And after 3, I'm going to say clap. When I say clap, you all clap together. So for someone who is outside, it's going to be like a massive sound. So get ready, everybody. I'm going to count until 1, 2, 3. When I say clap, you clap. So 1, 2, 3, clap. So I was with the brightest of the brightest here. So what I've shown you here is that action drives more than words. We all came here in Singapore with airplanes. And wherever you come from, this one airfare costs you more carbon emission than you are allowed for 1 or 2 years. I've been talking to you about all those things, and the reality is I still want to be home to see my family time to time in France, and that takes me to emit a lot of carbon emissions. So you will make your own choices. I cannot tell you what you should do and should not do. That will be your own conscience for that. Typically on our side, I've made a decision that every year I'm paying my right to pollute. So basically every year I buy carbon credit to offset the carbon emissions from my activities, and the same from my company. I made a choice 2.5 years ago to create my own consulting business called Zero Waste City, which aims to address some of the challenges I just told you earlier, with most obviously the depletion of resources. So companies, and you have heard it, a lot of it, we all want to move into a circular economy. We want to stop this throwaway society. Fair enough. But yet, you have to admit the fact that there is economic constraints, And you cannot ask a business to do a change if it's going to lose money or if it's going to go bankrupt. My job is to help those businesses to identify opportunities, to be more resource efficient, and at least mitigate the impact of resource depletion when they will come. When you talk to people about why they want to be more sustainable, whether it's zero waste or not, you will always have different reasons to do so. It can be because you want to be more competitive, you want to save money, you want to achieve sustainability target because your boss told you so, you want to have bigger goals around waste management, or simply be part of a company that show commitment and care for the community and the environment. It will be absolutely up to you to decide the type of people you want to work with and what you want to do within your reach. I hope I didn't depress you too much, but one thing you have to know is what I told you so far are heavy trends that will happen whether or not we like it. When we consume more and more oil, we have to admit that at some point there will be nothing left to extract. So what I told you by telling you all of this, I just want you to be aware that the climate change and the depletion of resources are changes we are going to face in the coming decades with plus or minus happy consequences. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rémi. One question first. Could you explain a bit more about Zero Waste City? What do you do concretely?
Sure. Oops. So I will give you a very practical example. I worked recently with a manufacturer in Singapore. I cannot tell you what they are doing, but this company every year generates about 3,000 tons of trash. This is 10 tons per day. Now, to put things in perspective, or for you to imagine, at home, you generate about 1 kilogram of trash per day. This company, every day, is 10,000 times the same amount. And to put things again in perspective, for you to imagine, between 4:30 and 8:30 in the morning, you have 3 individuals that come. They deliver 5 to 8 20-foot open-top containers and dump waste into it for 3 hours. Well, not everything goes to the incineration. Probably like about half of it goes to recycling plants. But the other half, which is still 5 tons every single day, goes to incineration. And whatever you burn is resources that is lost. The ashes will be buried into semi-carrier landfill forever. And every ton of cardboard you cut and you burn, it's 1 ton of cardboard you have to create, which means it's about 10 trees you have to cut down every time you're destroying resources. So what I did for this company is I basically give to the management team the tools to understand how waste is being managed, how resources is being lost, and of course, how much money they were losing. And as a result of this audit, we came out with a series of recommendations, and we told them, if you were going to change this process here and here, you could save about 100K per year in cost savings. And you will improve your recycling rate from 50% to 55%. Then we have given them even more recommendations further, which were plus or minus cost efficient for them. And at the end, they were like, okay, so if we do everything you have said, we could achieve a recycling rate of, I think it was 74% from the 50% right now, and save up to $400,000. So my job our job in this company is basically to help companies to identify opportunities to reduce waste, save money, and eventually achieve zero waste goals.
Thank you, Rémi. Another question is, would nuclear have a role to back renewable energy that are generally intermittent?
Yes. It depends the context. So nuclear energy is among the low carbon emissions energy. You have a few energies that are low carbons. You have nuclear, solar, wind, hydro, geothermal. and a few biomass products, biogas, for instance. Nuclear is definitely a good option, most likely as a transition energy to achieve our carbon emissions reduction targets. So we cannot expect nuclear to be the perfect long-term for everything, simply because the first source of energy we use for our economy today is crude oil. And we cannot use nuclear power plant in the cars, or in the truck, or in the ship. So we have to have solutions which are adaptable to the different form of utilization. And it's typically where people might actually talk about hydrogen power as a form to decarbonize the transportation industry. But again, to have hydrogen first, you need to have another form of energy, and nuclear can be an option. But the challenge is the amount of nuclear power plant to build is probably not even possible or safe to do.
Thank you. I'm continuing on the WhatsApp group. Is it morally acceptable to think that developing countries should not be able to reap the rewards of more accessible and affordable, for now, resources of energy, oil, coal, even though the now developed countries had that privilege in the past century?
So is it morally acceptable to say to countries burning coal that is not acceptable?
Yeah.
I don't think that's actually a good question, a good way to ask us the question. So everybody will have to do its part, and the reality is that the impact of global warming will be different depending on where you are. Singapore is probably the only first world country located into the equatorial belt. Everybody else is developing countries. And the funny thing is that Singapore, in some way, will be one of the most impacted countries because of climate change. First of all, obviously, because of seawater rising, but also because of the high increase in air temperature and hostile conditions. Singapore, as an example, its entire economy is based on fossil fuel. Electricity comes from at 95% from gas, 3% from waste, and about 2% from renewable energy. And it's only for electricity. If you take into account all the manufacturing industry and all the transportation industry, it's all gas and crude oil. So imagine that we want to say to Indonesia, now you have to stop burning coal and to be more sustainable. Fine. But we have to say the same to Singapore, right? But the question obviously is that shifting from one source of energy to another one takes investment, takes money, and who's going to pay for it? And that's where you go into moral ground of finding out who should pay for those emissions, because you might say that the the Western developed world is very much responsible for all the impact we had so far, and should they be the one to pay for all the activities done for the last 200 years? So I cannot obviously answer a specific question about it. The reality is that we need all together to act on it, and everybody with its own strengths and capacity.
Thank you. Another question, is any carbon credit trading system exist or is developed in Southeast Asia?
From memory, yes, Singapore does have a system, but I'm not fully aware of the system of carbon tax for Singapore and Southeast Asia.
All right. Maybe the last question I have here on the chat, it's regarding your business and area of expertise. Will you give an overview as to whether enough cities, industrial or commercial facilities are working towards zero waste for it to make enough a difference for 2050?
Sorry, can you repeat the question one more time?
The question is basically, do you know that any companies, cities, commercial facilities that are working on zero waste for 2050?
Yeah.
Any concrete actions that they want to take?
Fair enough. So the answer is yes. There's a lot of companies that have made some commitments of some sort to zero waste. Just to give an example, Unilever or P&G are companies that have in their sustainability policy a commitment to achieve zero waste to landfill or zero waste from manufacturing sites. In terms of cities, The most famous one is San Francisco, which has committed to be zero waste by 2030 from memory. Singapore has made a commitment to be on a journey towards zero waste. At the moment, Singapore has a target to achieve 70% overall recycling rate by 2030. And my hope is that they will go forward to a 90% recycling rate by 2050, but this one has not been committed yet.
Thank you. There is one question here. Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so thank you for raising awareness on this subject. But I'm always quite depressed after attending some conferences about climate change. So basically, what can we do in our daily life to change things, considering the fact that we are living in a plastic world here in Singapore, as you may know?
Yes, actually, I want to
thank you.
We here are amongst the richest people in the world. Wherever you come from, I can already tell you we are already all here, a part of the 10%, I think, the richest people in the world, simply because we took an airplane to come here. Because we are also the richer, we consume more resources, more services, and therefore we contribute to more carbon emissions. So if you want to have an impact as a person, there are multiple things you can do. And from memory, the two biggest ones you can choose to have is, unfortunately, less children. It's also to move towards more vegetarian or even vegan diets, less meat at least. You can choose to not own as much things, and particularly a car. And obviously, that's one thing I've mentioned is to actually consider to offset your carbon emissions. Yeah. Obviously, sorry, I missed that one. As much as possible, you want to avoid taking airplane for leisure. That's actually a very sad one to hear, but going to Bali on a weekend is unfortunately not the most environmentally friendly activity to do.
Yeah. I have a question. Thank you very much for the talk. It was very interesting. So there's for instance, Apple, the company, has announced that they'd be 100% carbon neutral by 2030. And I guess my question is, how can a company like Apple, that's such an emblem of capitalism and consumption, announce something like that? And is it just talk? Is it just marketing? Or will Apple be sustainable in the future? I don't, like, yeah, how?
Yeah. It is an extremely fair question. So we will face, and I do face myself, a lot of greenwashing around. So I'm not saying it's greenwashing, not exactly. But there's a lot of things that are unsaid in those statements of we are going to be 100% carbon neutral. So as I mentioned to you, the more we consume resources, the more energy we need to consume, and therefore the more carbon we emit. And if you want to see if a company is truly sustainable or truly committed to be sustainable in the long term, ask the question, is the business model, the entire business model of the company, sustainable by itself? Meaning that it could last for hundreds of years. If you take Apple, Apple is probably one of the most known companies to create a new product every year and make sure that everybody replaces their iPhone every year. This is, by default, unsustainable because every time you're buying a new iPhone, you are consuming more resources, more energy, and so on. If Apple was going to choose to make products which last in the time, which can be repaired, refurbished, and so on, then you could start to consider, oh, yes, that looks like a business model which is efficient. One thing I do not know about Apple is I do not know if they also offset the carbon emission associated to the manufacturing of the product, which for large part is outsourced to different companies. And this one I just don't know. Another thing you need to know is when you become carbon credit, unless you have actually bought a vacant land and grow forest to capture carbon, most of what company will do is basically pay the right to pollute. So basically, they will invest into forest, into projects to reduce carbon emissions somewhere else around the world, which is fine. It needs to be done. But sometimes you can also wonder if those projects are actually effective and useful. So there's actually another thing that you need to have in mind is if Apple says, now we are 100% carbon neutral, is that going to incentivize the staff, the employees, to act more on the side? Or are they going to say, oh, now we are already carbon neutral, there's nothing more we need to do? Depending on the company, there's actually a very high risk that by making statements like this one to say, oh, now we are 100% carbon neutral, they actually kill all the creativity of the staff to actually act in-house to reduce the carbon emissions, simply because management say, we have already achieved our commitment. So I hope it does answer the question, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, so for example, implementing tax on carbon emission could be one of the possibility to reduce carbon emission. And yeah, this is a more political question, but how do you think, like to what extent this could be possible to implement in the different countries?
So for all the French people around here, you probably remember the yellow vest, which was a movement that started 2 years ago because of a carbon tax. So when you implement a carbon tax, you naturally internalize costs associated to climate change. Therefore, you naturally increase the price of goods to the end consumer. And in our current world, if you start to institutionalize the reduction of purchasing power, it can be extremely hard for people to accept, particularly in democracies. So the answer is yes, it's definitely a good step in the right direction. But obviously, your capacity to implement it in specific countries will highly depend on the type of society you have. And how open they might be to this change, and if they accept and understand the change. And that is two very different things. So, as I've mentioned here, our energy consumption and our greenhouse gas emissions are linked to our economy. If we want to lead a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, we also need to accept a contraction of our economy. So, if you just say to people, oh, we're just going to increase the carbon tax, increase the price, and don't have a plan to address people that are going to lose their job, you are not doing it the right way. The reduction of energy consumption will happen because of the depletion of resources. Therefore, the contraction of the global economy will happen. So either we get ready for that, and we prepare a plan to give dignifying jobs to people at a lower pay, sure, but at least they will have a job and they won't stay and be scared of the tomorrow, or you don't. And if you don't, you have the risk of getting things like Syria or North Africa with civil unrest. So quickly to summarize the question, yes, carbon tax makes sense because they allow us to internalize the cost of climate change within our economy. But obviously, the way you implement it needs to be can be a challenging political move.
There is a question. Do you think the rapid digitalization and decentralization of the energy industry, such as virtual power plants, can contribute to a quick short-term decrease of primary energy source consumptions and support for further transition?
The answer is no. I will try to explain a bit more. So, we talk a lot about transforming our economy into a virtual one. But the reality is it has nothing virtual. Every single computer you have needs to be powered with energy, need to use servers that require rare earths to be manufactured in the first place. The decentralization of energy is definitely a good thing to have to help in resilience of our economic system and to ensure a supply of energy and guarantee the minimum services. But typically, if we talk about solar panels, which is one of the most decentralized systems you can imagine, it is not sufficient. It is a tool we can have in our palette for fighting climate change, but it's not the only thing we can rely on for that. The decentralization of the economy will happen. If you have less crude oil, you cannot move as much things around. And therefore, we might expect, we most likely expect, a decentralizing of the mean of production. So right now, if we take France, France produces most of its food in patches and of specific kind. The whole area around Paris almost is solely dedicated to wheat. Fine. It's currently being exported all around the world, all around Europe, using crude oil. But if you don't have as much crude oil, it's not going to work anymore. So we will start to see a diversification of the industry of smaller scale and more local to ensure the supply of those different goods using less energy.
Thank you so much. And the last one, could you give us some examples of consultancy work you do, type of missions or the customers, or a bit what you said, but maybe more precise?
Sure. So I've already given you an example just earlier. So the very first one we do offer is waste audit. So basically, our job is to quantifying and qualifying the different waste streams, and for each waste stream to find out where does the waste come from, and what can you do downstream to minimize the use of resources and to improve the recycling afterward. That's one of them. The second is a lot around regulatory compliance. So the ecosystem in Singapore is changing. There is new regulation coming in, such as the extended producer responsibility, which basically internalize the cost of waste management of the product you purchase. And for that particular case, we do help companies to adapt to the new regulation and ensure that they meet the obligation by the National Environment Agency.
Thank you very much, Rémi. Thank you for being with us this afternoon. Thank you.